It's exciting times because Australia is reopening, and just to see the feeling on the ground here in Melbourne is just tremendous. Looking forward to spending a few more days here as well, and this is a really great time. You know, Victoria, Melbourne in particular, has done it the hardest through this pandemic, and I want to thank everybody in Melbourne in particular, but right across Victoria, for the way that you've pushed through. And it's just so great to see Victoria reopening, New South Wales reopening, our borders reopening, and it's really put a spring in everybody's step. We've coming through this pandemic, because the pandemic's not over yet, but I've got to say we've come through this with one of the strongest economies in the world, with one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID in the world, and now we're approaching one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. But the big task for us now as a country is to secure our economic recovery, to deal with the challenges that still lie ahead of us. Yes, we've come through this pandemic in a way that few countries have, but we have many challenges now heading into the future. Here in Australia, one of those challenges is the action we're taking on climate change and dealing and responding to the actions that the world is taking in response to climate change. Angus Taylor and I have just come back from overseas from COP26, and there are a variety of responses and they all have impacts for Australia, and it's important that Australia has a clear plan to be able to deal with those. And our plan for securing Australia's economic recovery very much has our pathway to net zero emissions by 2050 at its heart. And that plan is driven by technology, not taxes. It's driven by backing Australians' choices, not putting mandates on them and telling them what to do. What we're seeing here at Toyota and around the world, and as Angus and I saw, and we're seeing in our own country, is that the costs of technology are coming down. And that means the choices that are available to Australians and right around the world are becoming more accessible. So our plans are all about supporting those choices, facilitating those choices, plugging the gaps where they need to be plugged to ensure that Australians can make the choices that they want to make. Our plans aren't about sending lots of taxpayers' money off to big multinationals to get costs down. They'll do that themselves. They've got a keen interest in doing that, just like Toyota does, to ensure that the product that they're offering on the market for electric vehicles is competitive. What we want our emissions reduction plan driven by is that competition, by that entrepreneurial spirit which seeks to drive down the cost of technologies so they're accessible to Australians. And today we are launching our future fuels and vehicle strategy. And that's all about putting this technology in the hands of Australians to make the choices they want to make. We're not going to tell them what to buy. We're not going to tell them where to drive or where they can't drive. We're not going to tell them how to live their lives and interfere in the way of life that they have. We're not going to put their petrol prices up to make them buy electric vehicles or do anything like that. Australians will make their own choices, and we're going to facilitate those by putting in place the infrastructure that enables them to make those choices into the future. Costs of electric vehicles, as I'm sure Angus will tell you, we'll see that continue to come down, as it happens with all technology. Time frames get shorter, the costs get cheaper, and then that makes it possible for more and more Australians. You don't get people to take on new technology by forcing up their household costs on all the other things they're currently using. You do it by ensuring you've got companies that are driving down the costs of their products and services to make them accessible to Australians so they can make the choices they want to make. So today, our plan, which is another key part of the overall national plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, this is one of the key building blocks. The future fuels and the take-up of electric vehicles driven by Australians' choices. And $250 million is being invested in this to ensure that we're doing the practical things. You know, taking action on climate change, it's a practical challenge. It's an economic challenge. It means that you need to ensure that you've got the infrastructure in place for hydrogen charging, just like what we're seeing here, and supporting those types of facilities. It's making sure there's smart charging facilities available to consumers. It's making sure that you don't crash the grid when everybody goes in to plug in for their vehicles into the future, which they will be doing more and more of in the future. It's about supporting, whether it's councils, to translate their vehicles into hydrogen-powered vehicles for their waste trucks, or indeed for large commercial fleets or heavy vehicles. Australia has quite specific challenges here. We're not like many European countries where a lot of these vehicles come from, or parts of Asia. I mean, we will see charging stations put in for electric vehicles in our metropolitan areas. That'll be done by the private sector because it makes sense for them to do that and they can fund that. But when you're talking about long-range distances, when you're talking about trucks and ships and things like this that have to go over long distances, this is why hydrogen is so important for Australia and why it's the fuel for Australia to enable us to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of net zero by 2050. A plan that actually backs Australians in rather than trying to legislate them out of jobs and legislate their choices for them. So with that, I'm going to ask Angus to take you through some of the key points of the strategy and then Tim to make a few further points. Welcome back, Angus, from Glasgow, and congratulations on pulling this together. It really does bring industry together with consumers and the government to ensure that people are able to make